Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato and this is round 13, the Belgian Grand Prix. Ferrari took a step forward in the power stakes at Spa-Francorchamps, but for the third race weekend in a row, rain intervened in Lewis Hamilton's favour, and the Briton seized pole position. But Sebastian Vettel made short work of Hamilton on the first lap, and not safety car nor strategy could prise the lead from his grasp. To help ask whether Ferrari and Vettel are now outright title favourites, I'm joined by F1 Statsman Sean Kelly. Sean, how are you doing?
Another day in paradise, what can I say?
Well, it wasn't exactly the thrilling race perhaps we expected. Belgium threatens rain, and I mean, we got some, but maybe not at the time that really turned this into a thriller.
Yeah, I would say that the rain thwarted what would otherwise have been a pretty perfect weekend for Ferrari. The fact that they led everything except Q3 when the rain hit really suggested that Mercedes seemed to be properly on the back foot. I mean, if you think about how things unfolded in Germany, where Vettel was on the course for victory until it rained. Then we had Hungary when we had the rain in qualifying, and that swung the grid order and so on. And then rain in Belgium put Hamilton on pole, but it didn't last long because Vettel was able to take advantage of the run up to Le Mans, seize the lead, and then after that, realistically never looked threatened.
I mean, that was the culmination of what was, I suppose, a milestone in terms of the fight between Ferrari and Mercedes, because for this race, which is the first of two back-to-back power circuits, really, the next one being Monza, we had the third and final engine upgrades for both teams. They were brought here for all of the customers as well, and Mercedes felt pretty confident about their one. I know after the race, so in retrospect, of course, you can say whatever you like, but they felt like this was quite a big step, quite a significant step, but disappointment for them that not only was Ferrari, who already seemed to have a bit of a power advantage before the break, bringing their own upgrade, but it seemed to be an even bigger step on top of that.
Yeah, and it was concealed by the events of Q3 when obviously the rains came and skewed the field slightly. If you actually look at the theoretical best times, like if you added up the three best sectors that everybody set in qualifying, which of course, counts the dry elements of Q2 and everything, what we would have ended up with an all Ferrari front row. We would have had Vettel on pole, we would have had Raikkonen second. So yeah, there's definitely big problems there. Ferrari quickest in sector 1, Ferrari quickest in sector 3. The twisty stuff in sector 2 went Hamilton's way. Ferrari quickest in the speed trap as well. So yeah, I think Mercedes have operated from a position of luxury since the turbo hybrid era began, because they've been comfortable in the notion that they had the best engine. Now, finally, 4 years in, Ferrari have not only caught up, but seem to have surpassed that. And it's definitely making a big difference.
We talk about qualifying. You mentioned there that Ferrari should have had a pace advantage. They did emerge with something, even if they didn't get pole position, and that was the fact that thanks to the power unit upgrades for both teams, Valtteri Bottas, who had already reached his maximum allocation for a number of power unit parts, was to start from the back. And though Kimi Raikkonen only qualified 6th, it still gave what should have been a tactical advantage for Ferrari, being able to use two cars to pincer Lewis Hamilton. So as much as Hamilton had that pole position, and even if he'd been able to maintain position off the line on the first lap, you'd have thought that this could have been a really quite a difficult race for Mercedes to navigate tactically, considering they would have had to cover off two different drivers.
Absolutely, yeah. And consider the cars that were between Raikkonen and Vettel on the grid, because normally it's a Mercedes, it's a couple of Red Bulls, people who a Ferrari driver is going to find difficult to pass. In Raikkonen's case, he was behind Grosjean, Perez and Ocon, which, with all due respect, are not in the league as the 2018 Ferrari. So you knew that all things being equal, Raikkonen would make fairly short work of passing them and getting on with the pursuit of Vettel or Hamilton. Or at the very least, if he couldn't keep pace with them, he would be in a spoiler capacity. So by the time you're starting to think about, okay, when are we boxing for an undercut or what have you, you've got to think about, well, where's Raikkonen in this? Is he going to be in a position where he's holding us up? Do we need to get out ahead of him? All those sorts of things. And of course, those are all questions that ultimately went unanswered because of everything that happened at La Source on the first lap.
Absolutely right. We'll get to that in just a moment. I thought it was interesting and worth noting as well, though, in qualifying, the downpour came between Q2 and Q3, and that really obviously excited everybody, for lack of a better word, not only for the form purposes of qualifying 3, but also in the sense of deciding what strategy to take into the top 10 shootout. Ferrari seemed to be in such a rush. Not only did they underfuel Kimi Räikkönen when he came in for the intermediate tyres, but also Sebastian Vettel struggled with managing his power and deployment on that final lap, which he put down to losing pole, and of course Kimi Räikkönen 6 he put down to not having that final run. It's the unpredictability of Spa-Francorchamps as well, isn't it, where you can't even plan necessarily for rain because it still catches people out.
Yeah, and Mercedes, I think, didn't expect there to be rain as well. If you look back at their Twitter feed, you'll see they tweeted a photograph of a set of wet tyres just before qualifying and said, "I don't think we'll be needing these today." to which I responded, "Have you ever been to Spa before?" It might look sunny right now. That usually means wait half an hour and it'll be raining. Or worse still, it'll be raining at one half of the track, but not all of it. And of course, that's exactly what it did. And even Sunday was like that. Even we didn't get rain in the race, but as the race finished, it was starting to spoil for rain. So yeah, it was maximum Spa, you might say. And I think you are right that it rattled Ferrari. There was a particular radio exchange that Vettel had with his crew when he came back into the pits at the end of his first run, I think it was in Q3, when he was yelling expletives at the team, worrying about damaging the floor by dragging the car into the garage incorrectly. And it all got a bit heated. And I'm sure none of that stuff would have happened if it had been dry. It would have been business as usual. Ferrari had sailed through the weekend up to that point. Can you believe that they'd led all 3 practice sessions? So can you believe that is only the second time that's happened at a Grand Prix weekend in 11 years? That's
an incredible statistic considering the performance they've had so far this year.
Yeah, an astounding number. Sochi 2017 was the only other time that has happened since, I believe, 2007. So, yeah, Ferrari were in the box seat and cruising, and then suddenly the rain came along and helped Lewis in the same way that it did in Hungary and the same way that it did in the German Grand Prix.
You couldn't imagine how Vettel must have been feeling. I mean, you could see it in his face. There was just disappointment in that face as he pulled up on the grid after qualifying because he knew that one had slipped out of his hands and he now had something of an unknown quantity for the Grand Prix to deal with Lewis Hamilton ahead. And I guess no one 100% sure the ultimate power stakes, given both teams, of course, like to hide a little bit until they get to a dry Q3, theoretically. And just before we consider what happened in that race, it is worth mentioning Force India, as you said, an extremely difficult off-season or mid-season for them going into administration. Now, probably coming out of administration, there's still a whole bunch of legal issues to be cleared up with them. They've always done quite well here, whatever you want to call this team on any particular day, I suppose. That team's always done quite well here. So an important performance for them, but also, I guess, illustrating when Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon do have that opportunity, they're the 2 drivers who really do seize upon it.
Yeah, it was a sensational debut by the Force India team, replacing the Force India team that were there before. And you are right, they do have a history of good results here. Sergio Perez seems to have a glass ceiling when it comes to qualifying higher than 4th. And the funny thing about it is that Perez has started 4th now 5 times in his career. 3 of them have been at Spa, but he's never started higher than 4th in his career. And it's probably a bit galling when Esteban Ocon, who has started higher than 4th before, did it again on this weekend. But yes, it was obviously a great boost for them. Again, they are pretty slippery when it comes down to straight line speed. Even if the Mercedes is no longer the dominant engine or power unit, as we call it now in Formula One. They were 2nd and 3rd in the speed traps. They've been consistently among the fastest guys in the trap all year, as they have been throughout the turbo hybrid era. They've continued to do that, and they took full advantage of the conditions in Q3. They really didn't have much business being as high as they were, particularly given that in Hungary they were eliminated in Q1, and there they were 3rd and 4th on the grid. So yeah, it was an opportunity well taken, but certainly historically having finished fourth and fifth in this race as recently as, I believe, 2016, it wasn't that much of a surprise to see Force India do better than expected at Spa.
And fortunately for them as well, managed to keep out of first lap chaos, which emerged just behind them, really, I suppose. There was this great tension, completely accidental tension on that first lap, because we had Vettel dueling Hamilton for the lead, and the Force India cars, it turned out, by the end of the Kevil Straight. But behind them, there was this really quite devastating accident between Nico Hulkenberg and Fernando Alonso, and then Charles Leclerc, and then Daniel Ricciardo and Kimi Raikkonen. And the timing of the safety car ultimately ended up being the tension. But if we consider this crash for a moment first, I thought it was interesting because it was Valtteri Bottas who had a small crash of his own at the same time. I think he tried to suggest that maybe he'd been distracted as he saw the chaos unfold in front of him. But both he and Nico Hulkenberg referenced the loss of downforce cars have when they're in a huge pack like that going into turn one as the reason that both of them rear-ended cars. Obviously, Nico Hulkenberg to a far more devastating effect. Is it really just a matter of it being that dramatic, in your opinion? I mean, they have race starts literally every race.
Yeah. Well, before we came on air here, I reviewed the start because obviously I knew we would be talking about it. At the time it happened, I thought Nico Hulkenberg's car had a rear brake failure because it seemed, if obviously people will be listening to this in Melbourne. Those of you who went to Melbourne for the 2014 race will remember Kamui Kobayashi kamikazeing the first corner in his Caterham and running straight into the back of Felipe Massa, which at the time everybody thought was driver error. But as it turned out, it was a rear brake failure. And Hulkenberg's accident, the way Hulkenberg went barreling into the back of Alonso at relatively unchecked speed, reminded me of that. And I thought that for a professional racing driver to misjudge his braking by that much, I find it hard to believe. This isn't some big-time Charlie who's here, or who's having his Grand Prix debut. This is a man who's done nearly 10 years of Formula One. And if you go and have a look at the replay of that, when Hulkenberg hits the brakes, everybody else brakes at the same time. Now, if he'd missed his braking point, what you would have seen is his car shoot way ahead of everybody else as everybody else hits the brakes before him. That doesn't actually happen. What actually happens is he hits the brakes, you hear the revs start to check up, and everybody else slows down at the same rate. And then suddenly he's going he's heading towards Alonso much quicker than everybody else is, which still makes me think that it really, the evidence, I know they said that they haven't said there was any mechanical failure, but I find it difficult to not believe my own eyes. Like, you're telling me a professional racing driver with that much experience gets it so wrong, hits the brakes at the right time, but yet goes barreling into the back of Alonso. I think he was still in fourth gear when he hit him. So that's a massive misjudgment. And I'd still wait to see Renault's sort of post-mortem of events there. But of course, it triggered the Alonso accident, which got all the headlines because he went up and over Charles Leclerc's car and left tire marks all over the halo. Now, of course, it's a matter of debate whether the halo was a life-saving addition in this instance. But the best thing you can say is better that it be there and not find out whether it was a life-saving addition or not. So, yeah, I always said that the first time, the people who said the halo was a bad thing, the first time that someone gets a direct hit from a wheel assembly and doesn't even retire from the race is the moment where where the debate ends, because then people will say this guy should literally be dead, and instead he's on the podium. So, it was always going to be that, and certainly in this case, I'm glad that it was on the car.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, there was an irony in Fernando Alonso being the driver that vaulted over Charles Leclerc, because only 6 years ago it was him in Leclerc's position being vaulted over by Romain Grosjean. And I mean, that accident was a real close call when you consider how close that Lotus car got to the cockpit where Fernando Alonso was sitting, how close it got to his hands on the steering wheel. So, I mean, that was obviously a close call, and no one was injured in that situation, but it's not the kind of close call where you could just walk away from it and go, that's just racing, that's fine, we have no problem with a car getting that close to the cockpit.
I've had a Twitter back and forth about this subject in the last 24 hours, and it seems that the halo still offends some people's sense of taste. And what I said in response was, the halo doesn't offend my sense of taste. What offends my sense of taste is having massive overly sensitive aero that stops the guys from racing. That's far more offensive to my sense of taste as someone who likes watching racing than whether or not a driver has adequate head protection. And in this instance, it may have saved a driver. So there will be much more severe incidents like this where it will save a driver. So I can't speak for everybody else, but from my perspective, I hardly even think about the halo anymore. It wasn't a conversation that I was going to have until suddenly a car hit the halo, and now suddenly it's, oh wow, that's the reason. That's why we've put it on there.
While that crash was happening, of course, at turn 1, Sebastian Vettel was busy taking the lead off Lewis Hamilton. He didn't even need to get all the way to Lecumbe. He did it sort of out up the top of Eau Rouge, really. He didn't need hardly any slipstream to get the work done. He was well past Lewis Hamilton by the braking zone. It was the Force Indias that took full advantage of the slipstreaming, and Esteban Ocon considered having a look in for the lead into the braking zone, though thought better of it, given his future's a little bit on the line, perhaps, and also the last thing you want to do is take out the championship contenders, I suppose. So some clever thinking there. But I guess if there was any moment, yes, obviously the slipstream was quite powerful because of the headwind down that straight. But if there was any moment that you really felt like the Ferrari power unit and package was really well put together and well equipped for this race, it was how quickly Sebastian Vettel was able to relieve Lewis Hamilton of that lead.
Right. And if you're gonna not lead into turn 1, this is one of the best tracks to be second into turn 1, because after you come out of La Source, you've got a good 20, 25 seconds of full throttle. So you've got plenty of time to get in a slipstream, to line up a pass. I don't think we quite expected the Force Indias to have quite as good of a go as they did. But yeah, I mean, Ocon was right to back out of it. It would have been a fantastic spectacle if he'd absolutely banzaied it on the brakes and gone into the lead. But it would have been equally as bad if he'd spent what may be his last weekend in the Force India drive taking out everyone in sight, Grosjean style. And it would have been, like, well, okay, that wasn't a great way to go out. But one thing I would say is that, yes, obviously the Vettel pass of Hamilton was critical to the outcome of the race. Arguably, just as critical was the collision between Ricciardo and Raikkonen at the first corner, which we didn't discuss, because what that did from a strategy point of view is completely clear up any ambiguities about strategy, because you took out Raikkonen and Ricciardo, there was no sense of, well, where are they going to drop in? Like, if we pit now, are we going to be behind these guys? Are we going to be ahead of them? When are they pitting? What tyres will they take? They were suddenly removed from the equation, and that gave us a much more conventional, very, very linear strategy for the race, for both Ferrari and for Mercedes.
And more importantly, it did make it exactly, as you sort of allude to there, a straight fight between Vettel and Hamilton. Not so much about the question of how the rest of the field would interact with them, but there was no opportunity for Ferrari to try to pincer Lewis Hamilton into taking a suboptimal strategy or covering off one driver at the expense of another. So there really was nowhere for Mercedes to hide at the end of this. And I think it was Toto Wolff's words after the race that said this showed up all of our deficits to Ferrari. There was no way for them to avoid that or blame anything else.
Right. And we knew from Friday that the one unknown was Hamilton and Vettel's pace on a long run on softs, because Hamilton and Vettel had both done their long runs on medium tyres on Friday. And obviously both had decided that the medium was not for them because they didn't run it in the race. We'd seen Raikkonen and Bottas run those tyres, the soft tyres, on Friday. Bottas was a little quicker than Raikkonen, but of course that doesn't necessarily translate to the other drivers in the cars. I also knew from looking at the performance of the super soft tyre on Friday that it was always likely that tyre was going to run longer in the race than people thought it would. There was a problem with blistering, particularly on the left rear tyre, particularly right through the center of the tyre, not on the shoulder, but right through the middle. But it didn't seem to affect the lap time unduly. And on that basis, I thought there could be a situation here where we're going to see someone try and push long on the super soft, because the tyre doesn't fall away as much as you would expect it to do. One of the other things that was something I was looking at but actually didn't transpire was the possibility that the delta from switching to a soft tyre for, the undercut, if you will, would be not as severe as it might have been at other tracks. Based on Friday's running, it seemed like that undercut was not as helpful as it has been at other circuits. That turned out to be not to be the case. The undercut was there, and Ferrari obviously had to react very quickly once Hamilton headed for pit lane.
Yeah, and that was one of two circumstances in which Hamilton could feasibly have perhaps taken the lead back from Sebastian Vettel. The first was, of course, the safety car restart, and there were thoughts of shades of the 2017 safety car restart where Lewis Hamilton had to quite brilliantly really defend Sebastian Vettel's advances by sort of easing off the throttle out of La Source to avoid being caught up by a slipstream. This year, though, Vettel didn't really have to think about that too much because it was, I suppose, Lewis Hamilton's eagerness to try and get that job done after the safety car line, which is at the bus stop chicane, essentially. But that put him too far back when he couldn't get the job done to really do what Vettel did to him on the first lap and slipstream him back up through the Kemmel Straight. And that was the first, I suppose, stint one for Vettel.
Right. I would say, I don't know if anyone asked Hamilton about that. I confess I haven't read any remarks from him about it, but I do wonder if even in the heat of the moment, he thought I shouldn't have done that. I should have hung back, should have maybe given us a little more patience. Because after, once Vettel was established in the lead on the way down, towards as far as Stavelo on the first lap under green, kind of looked pretty comfortable after that for the next hour and a half. It wasn't a situation where I thought Hamilton was ever likely to get him, and knowing that the car was so good in the dry running, that based on Friday's running, based on Saturday morning's running, it was always going to be a case of, well, it's an uphill battle now. You're going to have to wait for a mistake, or you're going to have to wait for, is Verstappen going to come into this in some shape or form? Because you've got no Ricciardo, you've got no Raikkonen, and realistically, you've got no Bottas. And of course, he didn't get that help.
The second opportunity Hamilton had, or the only other card he really had to play, that Mercedes had to play, was of course that sole pit stop window. And it looked like he was building up to perhaps a slightly more effective than it ended up being undercut as he approached the halfway distance. His stop came on lap 21 when it seemed like his tyres had finally started to give up. He'd set a couple of quick laps and then a slightly slower one as he came in. He had a deficit of around 3.5 seconds, and ultimately he emerged with a deficit of only about 1.5 seconds. And like you say, I mean, Ferrari only had to bring Sebastian Vettel in on the next lap to cover that off. But realistically, as much as, I mean, it ended up in the way everyone could have guessed with Ferrari maintaining the lead, it was perhaps slightly closer fought than we could have expected, if not simply because it did rely, of course, on Sebastian Vettel having a great pit stop, when a mistake at any part of the way really could have cost him quite significantly.
Right. I mean, at this stage of the game, you're just dealing with track position, aren't you? So it could be said that we didn't really see Vettel in a position where he had to pass Lewis in race conditions. Yes, I know he passed him on the first lap, but the first lap, all bets are off because it's extenuating circumstances. What would have happened had he emerged behind Hamilton? Would he have had that? Would he have been able to make advantage of the fact that they were quickest in Sector 1 and Sector 3? Would the DRS have been strong enough that he could have lined up and then even if he was 1.000 seconds behind, he could have still got past him. And even then, if he could have passed him with the DRS, would Hamilton have been able to hold that off? Would he have done what he did last year with the restart? We'll never know that, unfortunately. But you are right in that so much as Vettel's in-lap was a half second quicker than Hamilton's. Yes, Hamilton got stuck behind Verstappen, but in the end, it didn't really matter that much because Ferrari covered the stop on the next lap. Now, if Ferrari had left Vettel out, then we might have had a race. And teams are not beyond making such bad calls. So they did at least stay with Plan A. And I suspect it was made easier for them because they could obviously see there were no other cars in the way. It was just like, okay, the only person we've got to worry about this afternoon is Lewis. Whatever Lewis does, cover that, and we've got this in the bag. And they did exactly that. And of course, there was no other problems with virtual safety cars or safety cars which could have messed it up.
It was absolutely a straight fight between the two contenders for victory here. Just to look at those pit stop numbers, though, to illustrate how close I suppose it could have been. And this was the Mercedes gamble at the end of the day. It wasn't so much that the undercut by itself would work, but you hope, of course, that the other team just does a worse job than you do. Had the pit stops been executed to the same time, had they been equal time, the gap, rather than being a little over 1 second, could have been as little as about 0.8 of a second, at which point Vettel might have been coming out alongside Max Verstappen before Hamilton had a chance to pass him. And then you do wonder, had Hamilton been able to pass Verstappen faster, or had he not got stuck behind Verstappen, then that brings it well into that sort of grey area. And then, of course, you consider if Ferrari had made a mistake in the pit stop, then it was all up for grabs. So as much as this was, in standard circumstance, of course, with both teams being equal, a straightforward cover of an undercut, that is the risk of an undercut, right? That you try and pressure a team into a mistake because they weren't exactly ready to stop.
And we'd seen Ferrari get a little bit flustered in Q3. So if there was any possibility for a fumble, yeah, it was certainly going to be in those circumstances where you know that there's a minimum error. Yes, we can say, okay, Vettel pits, he comes out, he wins the race. But of course, that's assuming that everybody does what they're supposed to do. And when you've got that many people on a pit stop, that's not always the case. But, all credit to them. They did not make the mistakes that they had made on Saturday. 25 points.
And so that was Sebastian Vettel winning the Belgian Grand Prix. But if you wanted to compare a more interesting undercut situation, you have to go all the way to the bottom of the top 10. There wasn't a lot of fighting between the top 10 because it was mostly teammates following one another. But in 9th and 10th were Pierre Gasly and Marcus Ericsson. And what was really interesting here was that these are two cars, obviously, with two different strengths and weaknesses, given that Gasly has a Honda-powered Toro Rosso and Marcus Ericsson has the Ferrari-powered Sauber. And Ericsson had the contra strategy, starting on the harder tyre, whereas Gasly, qualifying in the top 10, started on the softer tyre, and they essentially had to swap compounds. But what was really interesting was that Toro Rosso found a gap in the field in time for the first pit stop, which allowed Pierre Gasly to make his stop, preempt the undercut, so stop before Marcus Ericsson and stop behind his teammate, Brendan Hartley, who then, of course, waved him through. But when Marcus Ericsson had no choice but to follow him in on the end of the next lap, he also got stuck behind Brendan Hartley, who, of course, then didn't wave Ericsson through, and they created this gap, which, of course, wasted Ericsson's new softer tyres and allowed Gasly to secure those 2 points in 9th place.
Is that right? I'm not sure because I'm often in my role I'm always watching the leaders, so it fascinates me to learn this for the first time. What's funny is in my job with the broadcasters, I'm often looking at what's happening, obviously at the sharp end of the grid, at the field. And it's only later in the race I start to look down and start to see, oh look, Marcus Ericsson's in the points. I'm almost like. It's similar to being on the pit wall. If I was on the pit wall at Mercedes and then late in the day you think, okay, well this is in the bag. What else is happening in this race? So that happens in this instance. So you're educating me as much as anything here, as much as people are listening to this. But I would say this though. I would say this from a statistical point of view. If I may wander away from strategy for just a second,
please.
Marcus Ericsson had a personal triumph this weekend. It was the first time in his Formula One career that he's now scored twice at the same track. Because he scored at Spa back in 2015, pointless in 2016 and 2017, like through the season, no points. Finally got back in the points in Bahrain this season, and Belgium was his fourth point of the year, I think. A bit of a moment of personal triumph for Ericsson and for Gasly too. Of course, it was the first time Gasly scored in consecutive Grand Prix. In his Formula One career. I don't think Honda are missing McLaren too much.
No, probably not. I imagine probably not. McLaren, on the other hand, well, they're probably not missing Honda either, although maybe they're missing the money that Honda was paying them. At least then they had something in exchange for their poor performances, as opposed to now when they have nothing. And this was another poor weekend, of course, for McLaren, with Stoffel Vandoorne at his home race qualifying last and McLaren finishing last with Stoffel Vandoorne in his home race. I thought it was interesting, though, if we compare these two engines, because we have McLaren obviously powered by Renault now, and then Toro Rosso powered by Honda, and neither was doing particularly well. I mean, we saw Stoffel Vandoorne struggling to pass or make any impact, really, on Brendan Hartley, who was powered by Honda. And then if we compare Carlos Sainz in the Renault Works team, he was spending a lot of his race stuck behind the Williams drivers. First Sergei Sirotkin and then Lance Stroll. And given this is a power-sensitive circuit, it really shows up the weaknesses in those engines, and it really does make you wonder the longer-term prospects for the two.
Right. Although I would like to say, Sergei Sirotkin had a much better weekend this weekend. He was the only driver. Not only is he the only driver who hasn't scored a point this season, he was also the only driver who'd never run in the points. He hadn't run in the top 10 for a single lap in his entire career, which he finally did conquer that. He got a good 10 or 12 laps in the points in Belgium. Didn't score, but he did beat Lance Stroll again. And given that Lance Stroll is apparently Force India bound in the near future, Sirotkin can at least give him that as a parting gift and say, well, if he's good enough, then why am I not good enough?
It's because his dad doesn't own a team. That's why he's not good enough.
Yes. This is probably probably one of the last instances where we'll say the Russian guy has less money.
Formula One delivers again.
Yeah.
Really. One driver I suppose we didn't mention, but this is because he did that standard thing he was expected to do, was Valtteri Bottas, who showed yet again having a front-running car start at the back of the grid is no impediment to finishing in the points, well in the points. In fact, he was even targeting a podium, which, who knows, maybe he would have been close to achieving had he not been caught up in that first lap mess.
Yeah. He had the fastest lap of the race, and We think it's easy to come from the back of the grid in one of these front-running cars. Valtteri Bottas he'd only ever had one top 4 finish in his career from outside the top 10 on the grid. He's not known for amazing comeback drives, but on this instance, he did what was expected of him. Again, assisted by the fact that there was a Ferrari missing and there was a Red Bull missing, because otherwise 6th might have been the best he could do. But he still finished 38 seconds behind Verstappen. So yeah, it was all he could do to finish 4th. If he'd gotten a safety car, we would have had a much different race. If he'd gotten a safety car later in the race, that is. Who knows? Maybe Red Bull would have said the same. We've seen, when there's a safety car later in the race, Red Bull tend to react more aggressively than the other guys in front of them. We might have had a much different finale because everybody had new sets of super softs available. So, that option did present itself, but sadly, nobody threw it into the hedge. So we never had that. A special point, by the way, of Max Verstappen. We mentioned that Van Dorn, the Belgian driver in the Belgian Grand Prix, was the last classified finisher. Well, Max Verstappen, of course, was also born in Belgium. So, for statistical purposes, I repurposed him as a Belgian for this race weekend. And if you do that, you can say statistically that he was the first Belgian-born driver to finish on the podium in the Belgian Grand Prix for 50 years.
Oh, wow. That's
5-0. Yes. Jackie Ickx finished 3rd at Spa in 1968. The same race where McLaren took their first Grand Prix World Championship victory, of course. Jackie Ickx was 3rd for Ferrari. There have been no other Belgian-born drivers officially on the podium until Verstappen on Sunday. There is a slight caveat to that. Thierry Boutsen was 3rd in 1988 and then was disqualified. But I'm not going to let that get in the way of a good stat.
Especially if we have to reclassify Max Verstappen, though, as being Belgian.
Yes. You have to bear in mind it was a slow news day, so I had to dig pretty deep to get that one.
Well, it's nonetheless an interesting one. I think Max Verstappen will take it. Considering how many Dutch people there were in the crowd, it may as well have been his home race, as pretty much any European race is these days. I feel like the way it's going with that travelling fan base of his. That was the Belgian Grand Prix. It delivered an interesting chapter in the championship narrative, even if it was a fairly straightforward way for Sebastian Vettel to get there. And Sean, it's been a pleasure to look back on the race with you.
Thanks very much.
That was F1 Statsman Sean Kelly. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. You can get every episode by subscribing to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you normally get your podcasts. And don't forget to leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com and stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter. And I'll catch you in just a week's time for a wrap-up of the Italian Grand Prix.